I watched Marcus's hand tremble as he slid the prenuptial agreement across the mahogany table, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from smiling. In my previous life, this moment had lasted 3 agonizing hours. I'd cried, begged, thrown the papers across the room. I'd hired 3 different lawyers who all told me the same thing: don't sign it. I'd fought until my throat was raw, and then I'd signed it anyway because my mother had clutched her chest and gasped about her heart condition, because my sister Amanda had whispered that I was being selfish and ungrateful, because Marcus had promised that it was just a formality his mother insisted on, that he'd never actually enforce it. They'd all lied. This time, I picked up the pen immediately. "Wait," Marcus said, his blue eyes widening. "Don't you want to, shouldn't you have a lawyer look at this?" I met his gaze steadily, watching the calculation behind those eyes I'd once thought were full of love. 28 days from now, I would die in a car accident that wasn't an accident at all. But that was the old timeline. That was the life where I'd been stupid enough to trust. "Why would I need a lawyer?" I asked, keeping my voice light and innocent. "Don't you love me, Marcus? Isn't this just a formality?" I watched him swallow hard. Across the table, my mother shifted in her seat, and Amanda's perfectly manicured hand tightened around her champagne glass. They'd all been so confident in my compliance in the first life. They'd orchestrated this entire thing like a well-rehearsed play. Marcus Thornfield, heir to a medical device empire, swept off his feet by a naive girl from a good-enough family. A family that was drowning in debt they'd hidden from me. A family that saw me as their winning lottery ticket. "Of course I love you," Marcus said. But I heard the slight pause, saw the microscopic glance he shot toward my mother. "But this is a serious legal document, Emily. Most people don't trust each other like we do," I interrupted, signing my name with a flourish. The muscle in his jaw twitched. "There, all done. When's the wedding again?" 3 weeks? 3 weeks, he confirmed weakly. My mother finally found her voice. "Emily, darling, perhaps you should just have someone glance at—" "Mom, it's fine." I stood up, smoothing down my dress. "I trust Marcus completely. And besides, isn't this what you wanted? For me to marry well to secure our family's future?" I watched her face carefully. "Isn't that what you've been telling me since I was 16? That I should use my assets wisely?" The words were poison sweet, and she couldn't argue without revealing her true nature. "Not yet. Not before the wedding. What none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly know, was that I'd already read every single word of this prenuptial agreement. Not in this life, but in my last one, when my lawyer had highlighted all the ways it would destroy me. Every clause designed to leave me with nothing. The infidelity clause that only applied to me. The forfeiture clause that stripped me of any claim to marital assets if I abandoned the marriage. The vague language about mental fitness that Marcus's lawyers could interpret however they wanted. I'd studied that document like a biblical text during the 2 years of legal hell that followed my attempt to divorce him. 2 years of court dates and manipulated evidence, and watching Marcus parade his mistresses, yes, plural, while his lawyers argued I was the unfaithful one. 2 years of my mother testifying against me, of Amanda swearing under oath that I'd always been unstable. 2 years that ended with me getting nothing, not even the inheritance from my father that they'd somehow transferred into a trust controlled by my mother. And then, 28 days after I'd signed the divorce papers that left me homeless and penniless, my brakes had failed on a mountain road. I'd woken up 6 months earlier, on the morning of my 25th birthday, screaming in a bed that shouldn't exist because I'd sold it to pay legal fees. It had taken me 3 days to accept that I'd somehow been given another chance. 3 days of crying, of checking dates, of seeing my father's watch still sitting on my dresser, the watch I'd pawned in the other timeline. But I wasn't that naive girl anymore. I was a woman who'd been betrayed by everyone she loved, who'd seen the monster behind Marcus's perfect smile, who'd heard her own mother lie on a witness stand. I was a woman who'd died knowing she'd been murdered by the people who were supposed to protect her. This time, I knew exactly what I was doing. In my first life, I'd grown up believing in fairy tales. My father, my real father, Robert Chen, not the weak man my mother had turned me against, had been a successful architect. He'd died at him when I was 12, and I'd grieved him genuinely, deeply. What I hadn't known was that he'd left me everything: a multi-million-dollar life insurance policy, the rights to several of his building designs that generated passive income, and a trust fund that was supposed to be untouchable until I turned 25. My mother, Helen, had been his second wife, a beautiful, calculating woman who'd seen a lonely widower with a young daughter as her ticket to a comfortable life. She'd brought Amanda, her daughter from her first marriage, into our home. Amanda had been sweet at first, or so my child self had believed. It wasn't until years after my father's death that I realized every cruel comment, every accident that ruined my things, every lie she told that got me in trouble had been deliberate. They'd worked on me for years, eroding my confidence, making me believe I was difficult, ungrateful, not quite good enough. My mother was a master at it: the sad sighs, the disappointed looks, the way she'd praise Amanda's mediocre achievements while dismissing my academic awards as showing off. By the time I was 18, I barely recognized myself. The confident, curious girl my father had raised had been replaced by someone who apologized for taking up space. The financial manipulation had been subtler. My mother was the executor of my father's estate, a role she'd parlayed into complete control. She'd convinced me that the money was family money, that we all needed to sacrifice. She'd sent Amanda to expensive private schools while I went to public school. She'd bought Amanda a car while I took the bus. And I'd accepted it all because she'd made me feel guilty for existing, for being the reason my father had money at all. When I'd met Marcus at 24, I'd thought I was finally getting my fairy tale. He was handsome, successful, from a good family. He'd pursued me with flowers and expensive dinners and pretty words. My mother had been thrilled. Amanda had been supportive in her way. It should have been my first warning sign. I'd been so desperate for approval, for love, that I hadn't questioned why a man like Marcus Thornfield wanted a girl like me. I hadn't wondered why he'd pushed for such a quick engagement, why he'd been so insistent on meeting my family immediately, why he'd had that prenup drawn up within a week of proposing. In my previous life, I'd learned the truth during the divorce proceedings. Marcus had been drowning in gambling debts, millions of dollars owed to people who didn't accept payment plans. His family's company was on the verge of bankruptcy, torpedoed by his father's bad investments and Marcus's own incompetence as COO. He'd needed money desperately, and my mother had told him exactly how to get it, because my mother, that loving, self-sacrificing woman, had already drained my trust fund nearly dry. She'd been forging my signature on documents for years, transferring money into accounts I didn't know about, using my father's legacy to fund Amanda's lifestyle and her own. By the time I was supposed to receive my inheritance at 25, there would be almost nothing left. But there was still the life insurance, still the design royalties, still the house my father had bought and put in a trust for me. My mother couldn't access those, not without me willingly signing them over, or without me dying and her being named as my heir. The plan had been elegant in its cruelty. Marcus would marry me, and the prenup would ensure that when the marriage ended, and they'd always planned for it to end, I would get nothing. During the marriage, my mother would convince me to add Marcus to my accounts for convenience, to put his name on my father's house to show trust, to combine our finances like real married couples do. And I, desperate for approval and love, had done it all. When I'd finally tried to leave, when I'd discovered Marcus in our bed with Amanda, another detail I'd blocked out until I'd lived through it again in my memories, they'd already stripped me of everything. The prenup meant I had no claim to Marcus's assets. My own assets were gone, transferred into accounts controlled by my mother or jointly held with Marcus. The divorce had been just the final nail in the coffin. And when I'd threatened to go public to tell everyone what they'd done, when I'd started digging into my mother's financial records and found evidence of fraud, well, that's when the car accident had been arranged. I'd died on a rainy night in November, my brakes failing on a mountain curve I'd driven 100 times. I'd died knowing it wasn't an accident. I'd died hearing Amanda's voice on my voicemail from that afternoon say, "You should really let this go, Em, for your own good." But I hadn't let it go. Even in death, I'd held on to my rage, my betrayal, my desperate wish for another chance. And somehow, impossibly, I'd gotten it. The morning after signing the prenup, I woke up in my small apartment, the one I'd kept despite Marcus's suggestions that I move into his place, and allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to cry. 5 minutes to mourn the girl I'd been. to grieve the father I'd lost, to rage at the injustice of it all. Then I dried my eyes, made coffee, and got to work. The first thing I did was call my father's old law firm. In my previous life, I'd never thought to question the lawyer who'd sent me annual statements about my trust fund. I'd trusted the numbers my mother had shown me, trusted her explanations about taxes and fees and necessary expenses. Yes, I'd like to make an appointment with someone who specializes in trust and estate law, I told the receptionist. Specifically, I need someone who can review my father's estate documents. Robert Chen. He passed away in 2012. The appointment was set for 2 days later. I spent those 48 hours playing the perfect bride-to-be. I met with the wedding planner my mother had chosen. She'd gone into debt to pay for a lavish ceremony that would showcase her successful daughter, money she planned to recoup from my accounts after the wedding. I smiled through dress fittings with Amanda, who kept making little comments about how the princess style was maybe a bit young for me, how the veil was trying too hard. You're right, I said, watching her eyes light up at this unusual agreement. Maybe I should go simpler. Classic. What about that designer you like? Vera Wang? Amanda's expression froze. In my previous life, she'd worn Vera Wang to my wedding as maid of honor, a dress that cost more than most people's cars. A dress I'd paid for because my mother had convinced me it was tradition. That might be out of budget, my mother interjected quickly. Oh, but Amanda deserves it, I said innocently. She's my maid of honor. I want her to feel beautiful too. Don't worry about the cost. I'm sure there's room in the wedding budget. I watched my mother's mind work, calculating whether it was worth the expense to keep me compliant. The wedding was an investment after all. They needed me happy and obedient for just a few more weeks. We'll see what we can find, she finally said. That evening, Marcus took me to dinner at an expensive restaurant. He was nervous, I could tell. The prenup signing hadn't gone the way he'd expected, and it had thrown him off his game. You know, he said, reaching across the table to take my hand, I was thinking, after the wedding, we should probably combine our bank accounts. Make everything simpler. There it was, right on schedule. That's sweet, I said, squeezing his hand. But I've been thinking, too. My financial advisor suggested I might want to keep some accounts separate. For tax purposes. Apparently, it can be beneficial for married couples in certain income brackets. I didn't have a financial advisor, but Marcus didn't know that. Your financial advisor? His hand tightened slightly on mine. I didn't know you had one. Oh, didn't I mention? I set up a meeting with someone from Morgan Stanley, just to make sure I'm being smart with my inheritance. The trust fund matures on my 25th birthday, and I want to make sure I'm investing it wisely. I took a sip of wine, watching him over the rim of my glass. I'm turning 25 3 days after the wedding. The timing worked out perfectly, don't you think? His face had gone slightly pale. How much? I mean, you've never really talked about the specifics of your inheritance. Haven't I? Well, it's not something I like to brag about. But you're going to be my husband, so you should know. I leaned in conspiratorially. Daddy set up a very generous trust. Plus the life insurance, the royalties from his designs, the property holdings. My advisor estimates it's worth about $8 million, give or take. It was actually worth closer to $12 million, based on what I'd discovered during my divorce proceedings in the previous timeline. But I wanted to see what he'd do with 8. Marcus's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, greed, calculation, and finally, a practiced smile. Emily, that's wonderful. Your father really loved you. He did, I said softly, and for a moment the grief was real. He really did. But Marcus continued carefully, you might want to reconsider that prenup. I mean, if you have that kind of money, the terms might not be favorable to you. I laughed, a light, carefree sound. Marcus, we're going to be married. What's mine is yours, right? The prenup doesn't matter. We're in this together. I could see the conflict in his eyes. On one hand, he wanted me to tear up the prenup so he'd have a clearer claim to my money during the divorce. On the other hand, if I was this trusting, this naive, maybe the prenup was better. It would protect him from having to split his debts with me when everything fell apart. If you're sure, he said finally. I'm sure, I told him. I've never been more sure of anything. The meeting at my father's law firm changed everything. Martin Jacobson was in his 60s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He'd been my father's friend as well as his lawyer, and when I mentioned my father's name, his whole face softened. Emily Chen, he said, shaking my hand. My God, you look just like Robert. I was so sorry to hear about his passing. He was a good man. Thank you, I said. Mr. Jacobson, I need to ask you about my father's estate, specifically about the trust fund. His eyebrows rose. The trust fund? You should be getting regular statements. It matures on your 25th birthday, which is... Let me see. He checked his computer. Next week. Congratulations. Yes, I said carefully. I am getting statements, but I'd like to see the original trust documents, and I'd like you to explain exactly how the trust works, who has access to it, and what the balance should be. Something in my tone made him pause. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Let me pull the files. It took him 20 minutes to gather everything. When he spread the documents across his desk, my hands shook. Your father set up this trust when you were born, Martin explained. The principal was $2 million from his life insurance. It's been invested conservatively, generating approximately 6 to 7% annually, with compound interest over 25 years. He pulled up a spreadsheet. The current balance should be approximately $8.2 million. And the statements I've been receiving show... May I see them? I handed over the folder my mother had given me over the years. Martin examined them, his frown deepening. These appear to be legitimate statements from the trust account, he said slowly. But the balance shown is... Emily, this shows only $400,000. I know. That's not possible. The trust has very specific terms. Your mother, as executor of your father's estate, had no access to the principal. She could only manage the distributions, which were designated for your education and living expenses until you turned 25. But those distributions came from the interest, not the principal. The principal should have remained intact and growing. My throat tightened. What if someone had been forging my signature, transferring money out? Martin's expression turned grim. That would be fraud. Serious fraud. Emily, do you have reason to believe... I have reason to believe my mother has been stealing from me for years, I said flatly. I need you to investigate. I need you to get me the real statements, the transaction history, everything. And I need you to do it quietly. She doesn't know I'm looking into this. If what you're saying is true, we should involve the police. Not yet. First, I need proof. And I need to make sure she can't hide the evidence or transfer more money before we act. Martin studied me with new respect. You're getting married soon, aren't you? I saw the announcement. Yes, to Marcus Thornfield. His expression flickered with something I couldn't quite read. I know the Thornfield family. Emily, has Marcus asked you to sign a prenuptial agreement? I already signed it. Did you have a lawyer review it? No, but I know exactly what's in it. Martin leaned back in his chair. You're playing a very dangerous game. I'm playing the only game I can win, I told him. My mother stole my inheritance. The man I'm supposed to marry is working with her. They want to take everything my father left me and leave me with nothing. But they don't know that I know, and that's my advantage. What do you need from me? I need you to freeze the trust account the moment it matures. I need you to investigate every transaction going back 10 years. I need you to document everything so that when I'm ready to act, I have evidence that will hold up in court. And I need you to explain something to me. What's that? The prenup I signed. One of the clauses says that any assets I bring into the marriage remain my separate property unless I explicitly add my spouse to the account or title. It also says that any inheritance I receive during the marriage is considered separate property. Is that standard? Martin pulled out a legal pad. Let me see the prenup. I'd brought a copy, of course. I watched him read through it, watched his eyebrows climb higher and higher. Emily, he said finally, this prenuptial agreement is extraordinarily one-sided. It protects Marcus's assets completely while leaving you with almost nothing if the marriage ends. But yes, you're correct about those clauses. As written, any inheritance or trust fund that matures in your name during the marriage would remain your separate property, provided you don't commingle it with marital assets. And if I were to, say, keep that inheritance in a separate account that only I have access to, then Marcus would have no claim to it in a divorce. But Emily, why would you sign this if you knew? Because they expected me to fight it, I said. They expected lawyers and negotiations, and ultimately, they expected me to sign it anyway because my mother would pressure me. But the fight would have given them time to prepare, to move money around, to make sure I never saw evidence of what they'd done. By signing immediately, I surprised them. I made them wonder what I know. And more importantly, I made them confident that I'm still the naive little girl they can manipulate. But you're not. No, I agreed. Onion. I'm not. Martin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, your father would be proud of you and furious about what's been done to you. My eyes burned. Will you help me? Every step of the way, he promised. The week before my wedding, things started to accelerate. Martin called me with his preliminary findings. My mother had been systematically looting my trust fund for 8 years, using forged documents and a complicit bank officer who'd been accepting bribes. She'd transferred over $6 million into various accounts, most of which she'd already spent on Amanda's lifestyle, her own expenses, and paying off debts. The remaining funds had been moved into an offshore account 3 months ago, right around the time she'd introduced me to Marcus. We have enough for a criminal case, Martin told me. But, Emily, if we act now, there's a chance she could flee or hide what's left. I know, I said. That's why we're waiting until after the wedding. After? The trust matures 3 days after my wedding. On my birthday. That's when we move. I want her confident, comfortable. I want her thinking she's won. And Marcus? Marcus has his own problems, I said grimly. Because I'd been doing my own investigation. In my previous life, I'd been too destroyed by the divorce to dig deeply into Marcus's background. But now, with time and foreknowledge, I'd hired a private investigator using money from a secret account my mother didn't know about, an account I'd opened the day I woke up in my second life. The PI's report was damning. Marcus's gambling debts totaled $4.3 million, owed to 3 different casinos and a loan shark who had connections to organized crime. The Thornfield family company was indeed failing, kept afloat only by creative accounting that bordered on fraud. Marcus's father had dementia, and Marcus's mother was desperate to maintain their social standing even as they bled money. But the most interesting part was Marcus's pattern. I wasn't his first target. There had been 2 other women, both from wealthy families, both courted and discarded when their families got suspicious, or when Marcus had extracted what he could. One had filed a civil suit that had been quietly settled. The other had taken her own life. I cried when I read that last part. Cried for the woman I'd never met, for the girl I'd been, for everyone Marcus had destroyed in his wake. Then I dried my eyes and kept planning. The wedding itself was a blur of white lace and forced smiles. Amanda wore her Vera Wang dress and pretended to be happy for me. My mother cried tears of joy that I knew were tears of relief. She'd finally gotten me married off to someone who could be controlled. Marcus kissed me at the altar and whispered, "I love you, Mrs. Thornfield." And I heard only the lie beneath the words. At the reception, I watched them all celebrating. My mother, already mentally spending my trust fund. Amanda, eyeing Marcus's groomsmen like they were her next targets. Marcus himself, drinking too much champagne and checking his phone obsessively, probably calculating how quickly he could access my money. I danced with my new husband and thought about the prenup sitting in a safe deposit box. The prenup he thought protected him. The prenup I'd signed without a fight because I knew something he didn't. 3 days, that's all I needed to wait. On my 25th birthday, I Woke up alone in the penthouse apartment Marcus had insisted we move into after the wedding. He'd left early for work, though I knew from my PI that he was probably at the casino, trying to win enough to make a dent in his debts before his creditors got impatient. I made coffee, ate breakfast, and at exactly 9 o'clock a.m., I walked into Martin Jacobson's office. "Happy birthday," he said, handing me a folder. "Your trust fund officially matured at midnight. I've had the entire balance transferred to a new account in your name only at a different bank. I've also filed the necessary paperwork to have your mother removed as executor of your father's estate, citing fraud and embezzlement. And the evidence? Documented, notarized, and copied. I've sent one set to the district attorney's office, one to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and I'm keeping the originals in my safe. Your mother will be arrested this afternoon." I let out a breath I'd been holding for what felt like years. "Thank you." "There's more," Martin said. "The bank officer who helped her has already agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. We also found evidence that your mother took out several credit cards in your name and maxed them out. That's identity theft on top of everything else." "And Amanda?" "She received over $1 million from your trust fund, which your mother designated as gifts. Whether she knew the money was stolen is hard to prove, but at minimum, she'll have to pay it back." "She knew," I said quietly. "She's always known." My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "We need to talk. Come home." I showed it to Martin. He knows something's wrong. The trust fund transfer probably triggered alerts. If he was monitoring your accounts, he was, I confirmed. I made sure of it. I wanted him to see exactly where the money went. An account he has no access to, an account protected by the prenuptial agreement he insisted I sign. Martin's smile was sharp. "You used his own weapon against him." "I learned from the best," I said. "My father taught me to play chess. Always think 3 moves ahead." When I returned to the apartment, Marcus was pacing in the living room. His face was flushed, his tie loosened, and I could smell whiskey even though it wasn't even noon. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded. "It's my birthday," I said calmly. "I went to see my lawyer." "Your lawyer? What lawyer? You don't have a lawyer." "I do now, Martin Jacobson. He was my father's attorney. He's been very helpful." Marcus's face went white. "What did you do?" "I accessed my trust fund. It matured today, as you know. $8.2 million, all transferred to a secure account." You can't just... We're married. That money belongs to both of us." I tilted my head. "Does it? Because I seem to remember signing a prenuptial agreement that explicitly states any inheritance I receive during our marriage remains my separate property." "You insisted on that clause, actually. Your lawyers were very thorough." I watched the realization hit him like a physical blow. The prenup he'd thought would protect him from sharing his debts with me, the prenup he'd designed to leave me with nothing when he divorced me, had just locked him out of the very money he'd married me to access. "Emily, you don't understand," he said, switching tactics, his voice turning pleading. "I'm in trouble. I owe people money, dangerous people. You need $4.3 million to cover your gambling debts," I said. "I know. I also know about the 2 other women you targeted before me. I know about Sarah Mitchell, who killed herself after you destroyed her. I know about Rachel Kwan, who sued you for fraud. I know everything, Marcus." His face cycled through shock, fear, and finally, rage. "You bitch. You've been playing me this whole time." "No," I said. "You've been playing yourself. I just stopped being an easy mark." He lunged at me, but I'd been expecting it. I pressed a button on my phone, and suddenly my voice filled the room, my voice and his, from a conversation we'd had 2 nights ago, one I'd secretly recorded. "Once we get the trust fund, we'll keep her happy for a few months. Then I'll file for divorce, claim infidelity. Your mother has already agreed to testify that Emily has always been unstable. With the prenup, she gets nothing, and I keep everything. And if she fights it, then we'll make sure she can't. An accident, maybe. Your mother has some ideas. Marcus froze. Where did you, how did you thought I was asleep that night. I wasn't. And you thought I was stupid enough to not record it. I wasn't. I stopped the recording. I have hours of conversations, Marcus. Every incriminating thing you've said for the past 3 weeks. Every time you talked to your mother about handling me. Every time you laughed about how naive I was. You can't prove anything, he said desperately, but no one will believe. The district attorney's office already has copies, I said, along with evidence of your fraud, your conspiracy to commit murder, and several other charges I'm sure they'll explain when they arrest you. Which should be, I checked my watch, any minute now. Right on cue, there was a knock at the door, not just a knock, the authoritative bang of law enforcement. NYPD, open up! Marcus looked at me with hatred so pure it should have scared me. But I'd already been murdered by this man in another life. I'd already lost everything to his lies. There was nothing he could do to me now that was worse than what I'd already survived. One more thing, I said as the police broke down the door. The prenup you had your lawyers draft? It has a clause that says if either party is convicted of a crime during the marriage, the other party is entitled to pursue dissolution of the marriage with full forfeiture of the guilty party's assets. Your lawyers put it in to protect you from me, but it works both ways, Marcus. When you're convicted of fraud and conspiracy to commit murder, I'll get everything. Your company, your properties, your trust fund, what's left of it anyway, after your debts are paid. The police flooded into the apartment. I stepped aside and watched them tackle my husband to the ground, watched them cuff his hands behind his back, watched the fear finally bloom in his eyes as he understood that he'd been outplayed. How? Us, he gasped as they hauled him to his feet. How did you know? I leaned in close and whispered, because you already killed me once, Marcus. But I came back. His eyes widened in confusion and terror, but then the police were dragging him away, reading him his rights. And I was alone in the apartment that had never felt like home. I sat down on the couch and called Martin. It's done, I said. Marcus has been arrested. What about my mother? Picked up an hour ago. She's trying to claim she was helping you, that the transfers were authorized, but we have the forged signatures. The bank officer already testified. She's being charged with embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. And Amanda? She's not being charged criminally, but she has to pay back the money. All of it. With interest. Her lawyers estimate it will bankrupt her. I closed my eyes. In my previous life, they'd all gotten away with it. They'd stolen everything, destroyed me, killed me, and faced no consequences, but this time, justice was finally being served. Thank you, Martin. Thank you for trusting me, Emily. Your father would be so proud. The next 6 months were a whirlwind of court dates, testimonies, and revelations. The newspapers had a field day with the socialite swindle, as they dubbed it. Marcus's trial was particularly sensational. The prosecutor painted a picture of a serial con artist who'd preyed on vulnerable women, who'd conspired with my mother to steal my inheritance, who'd planned to murder me for insurance money once he'd drained my accounts. The tapes I'd made were played in court. The jury's faces when they heard Marcus and his mother casually discussing my accident were seared into my memory. When the verdict came back guilty on all counts, I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't even known was tight. My mother's trial was shorter, but no less damning. The evidence of her systematic theft was overwhelming. Her lawyer tried to argue that she'd needed the money to support me, that she'd been a struggling single mother. But the bank records told a different story. Designer handbags, luxury vacations, a sports car for Amanda. She was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Amanda avoided jail, but not consequences. She had to sell her apartment, her car, all her designer clothes and jewelry. She had to get a real job for the first time in her life. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was working as a receptionist at a dental office, living in a studio apartment in Queens, and bitterly complaining about how unfair it all was. I felt no sympathy. As for the money, I got it all back. The $8.2 million from my trust fund, the $6 million my mother had stolen and hidden in offshore accounts, the royalties from my father's designs that my mother had been collecting and spending, the house my father had bought, which I'd never even known existed until Martin found the deed. But more than that, I got something else back. Myself. 1 year after my 25th birthday, I stood in front of my father's grave with flowers in my hand. It was a crisp autumn day, the kind of day he'd loved, the kind of day we'd spent together when I was a child, him teaching me about architecture, pointing out the beauty in building structures, in foundations that held firm. "I did it, Daddy," I whispered. "I got them all, and I got your legacy back." The gravestone was simple. Robert Chen, beloved father and architect. I'd had it replaced. My mother had chosen the original, and it had said nothing about how much he'd loved me, how hard he'd worked to secure my future. I traced his name with my fingers and let myself cry. Not tears of grief anymore, but of relief, of victory, of finally being free. Behind me, I heard footsteps. I turned to see Martin Jacobson approaching, carrying his own small bouquet. "I hope you don't mind," he said. "Robert was my friend. I try to visit a few times a year." "I don't mind at all." We stood together in silence for a moment. Then Martin said, "I have news. The Thornfield Company declared bankruptcy last week. It's being liquidated. As Marcus's wife and the beneficiary of the forfeiture clause in your prenup, you're entitled to proceeds from the sale." I laughed. That would have seemed impossible a year ago. "How much?" "After the creditors are paid? About $2 million. It's not much compared to what you already have, but it's poetic," I finished. "He married me for my money, and in the end, I got his." "Poetic indeed. What about his gambling debts?" "Not your problem. His creditors can't touch you. The prenup protects you from his debts just as much as it protected him from yours." "Well, it would have if he'd had any assets left to protect." I thought about Marcus, sitting in a federal prison, facing 25 years for fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. I thought about my mother in her own prison, probably still believing she was the victim of some injustice. I thought about Amanda, learning for the first time in her life that actions had consequences, and I felt nothing but satisfaction. "I'm starting a foundation," I told Martin, "in my father's name. It will provide scholarships for students studying architecture, especially those from single-parent families. It will also fund legal aid for people dealing with estate fraud." "That's a wonderful idea." "And I'm going back to school. I'm going to finish my degree, maybe become an architect myself." Martin smiled. "Your father would love that." We said our goodbyes to my father together, then walked back to the parking lot. As I drove away from the cemetery, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror and almost didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. She was strong, she was confident, she was free. She was everything I'd been before they'd broken me and everything I'd become after I'd put myself back together. 2 years after my rebirth, I sat in the office of my new architecture firm, a small practice I'd started with some of my inheritance, focusing on affordable housing and sustainable design. My father's work had always been about creating beautiful spaces for people to live and thrive. I was carrying on that legacy in my own way. My phone rang, an unknown number. "Hello? Emily, it's Amanda." I hadn't heard her voice in over a year. The last time had been at her deposition, where she'd tried to claim she hadn't known the money was stolen, hadn't known about the plan to kill me. The judge hadn't believed her any more than I had. "What do you want, Amanda?" I wanted to say I'm sorry." Her voice was small, broken. "I was wrong. What we did to you was wrong. Mom was wrong. You should have what?" I interrupted. "You should have stopped her? You should have told me the truth? You should have not spent over $1 million of my money on clothes and cars and vacations?" I know, I was greedy and selfish and I hurt you. But Emily, I'm your sister. You were never my sister, I said, and my voice was steel. A sister doesn't steal. A sister doesn't lie. A sister doesn't help plan your murder. You were just someone who lived in my house and took advantage of my father's kindness. Please, I've lost everything. I'm barely surviving. If you could just what? Give you money? Help you out? Amanda, I died because of you. Maybe not literally in this timeline, but in another life, your actions led to my death. And you think I owe you something? You died? What are you talking about? I smiled coldly. Nothing. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you made your choices, Amanda. You chose greed over family. You chose mom over doing the right thing. And now you get to live with those consequences. So that's it? You're just going to let me suffer? I'm not making you suffer, I said. The world is just finally holding you accountable. There's a difference. I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking, but not from weakness, from power. From the knowledge that I'd finally, truly taken control of my own life. A knock on my office door pulled me from my thoughts. Come in! My assistant, a bright young woman named Sarah, yes, I'd hired someone with the same name as the woman Marcus had driven to suicide, in her honor, poked her head in. Your 3 o'clock is here. The pro bono case. The woman whose family is trying to declare her incompetent to steal her inheritance? I stood up, straightening my blazer. Send her in. Because this was what I did now. I helped women who were being victimized by the people who were supposed to love them. I used my money, my knowledge, my hard-won expertise to fight for people who were where I'd been. People who were being gaslighted, manipulated, robbed blind by family members they trusted. Some of them I could help financially. Others I helped by connecting them with lawyers, investigators, therapists. I helped them see that they weren't crazy, that they deserved better, that they could fight back. I was turning my pain into purpose, my trauma into triumph. The woman who walked into my office was in her early 30s with scared eyes and trembling hands. She clutched a folder of documents like it was a lifeline. Thank you for seeing me, she whispered. I didn't know who else to turn to. My mother, she's been taking my money. And my brother says I'm paranoid, that I need help, that I should sign power of attorney over to him for my own good. But I know something's wrong. I just can't prove it. I smiled at her, warm and genuine. You're not paranoid. You're not crazy. And yes, you can prove it. Sit down. Tell me everything. As she began to talk, pouring out her story of manipulation and financial abuse, I thought about the girl I'd been 2 years ago. The girl who'd signed a prenup without understanding what she was doing. The girl who'd trusted all the wrong people. That girl was gone. She'd died in a car accident in another timeline. But from her ashes, I'd been reborn, stronger, wiser, unbreakable, and I was never going to let anyone make me feel small again. 5 years after my rebirth, I attended the parole hearing for my mother. I didn't have to go. Martin had advised against it, said it would just upset me, but I needed to see her, needed to look her in the eyes and know that I'd truly won. She'd aged badly in prison. Her hair was gray, her face gaunt, the expensive skincare routine she'd maintained with my money long gone. She looked like what she was, a woman who'd gambled everything on greed and lost. When it was my turn to speak, to give my victim impact statement, I stood up and faced the parole board. My mother stole $8 million from me, I said clearly. She forged my signature, she committed fraud, and she conspired to have me killed when I threatened to expose her. But more than that, she stole my childhood. She made me believe I was worthless, that I was difficult, that I should be grateful for the scraps of love she threw my way. She used my grief over my father's death to manipulate me into giving her control over every aspect of my life. I looked directly at her. She couldn't meet my eyes. She taught my stepsister to treat me like garbage. She helped a con artist target me for my inheritance. She planned my death like it was just another item on her, a to-do list, and when I found out, when I fought back, she got on the witness stand and lied about me under oath. My voice didn't shake, my hands didn't tremble. I'm here today to tell the parole board that my mother is not rehabilitated. She's not sorry, she's just sorry she got caught. And if you let her out early, she'll just find another victim to manipulate, another person to use, another life to destroy. I also want the board to know that I've moved on. I have a successful career. I'm happy. I'm healthy. I've built a life that honors my father's memory. And I did it all without her, despite her best efforts to destroy me. She has no power over me anymore. I sat down. The parole board deliberated for less than 20 minutes. Parole denied. As I left the hearing room, I passed my mother being led back to the prison transport. She called out to me, "Emily! Emily, please, I'm your mother. You can't just abandon me." I stopped, turned, looked at her one last time. "You stopped being my mother the day you decided my trust fund was more valuable than my trust," I said. "Goodbye, Helen." I walked away and didn't look back. 10 years after my rebirth, I stood in front of a completed building, a low-income housing complex I'd designed, funded partially by my foundation and partially by city grants. It was beautiful in its simplicity: clean lines, sustainable materials, communal gardens, spaces designed for families to thrive. There was a plaque by the entrance, the Robert Chen Community Center, in memory of a father who built with love. I touched the plaque and felt the familiar ache of grief, softened now by time and healing. My father would never see this building, never know how his legacy had lived on through me. But somehow I felt like he knew anyway. "It's beautiful," a voice said behind me. I turned to see a man about my age in casual clothes holding a coffee cup. "Thank you. Are you the architect?" "I am, Emily Chen." "David Park," he said, extending his hand. "I'm moving into Unit 3B next week. Single dad, 2 kids. This place it's a miracle, honestly. Affordable housing in this neighborhood, with a community center and a garden. I didn't think places like this existed anymore." "They should," I said. "Everyone deserves a safe, beautiful place to live." My father believed that. I believe it too. We talked for a while about the building, about his kids, about architecture and design. He was easy to talk to, genuine, kind. When he mentioned he was a teacher, I felt something flutter in my chest. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, maybe, or possibility. "Would you maybe want to grab coffee sometime?" he asked hesitantly. "I mean, as a thank you for creating this amazing place, and because you seem really interesting. And I promise I'm not a scammer or a con artist or anything." He laughed awkwardly. "Sorry, that's a weird thing to promise up front." I laughed too, and it felt good. Natural. "Coffee sounds nice." We exchanged numbers. As he walked away, I felt lighter than I had in years, lighter than I'd ever felt in my entire previous life, because I'd learned the most important lesson. I was enough. Just me, Emily Chen, daughter of Robert Chen. I didn't need to be perfect or compliant or grateful for scraps. I didn't need to make myself smaller to fit into someone else's idea of who I should be. I was exactly who I was supposed to be. And I'd built a life, a real life, a true life, on foundations of truth and justice and love. The kind of foundations my father had taught me about. The kind that held firm even when everything else tried to shake them down. Marcus was still in prison. My mother was still in prison. Amanda was still struggling to rebuild a life she'd destroyed through greed. And I was here, free and whole and happy, designing buildings that would shelter families for generations, helping women escape the kinds of traps that had once ensnared me, dating nice men who taught high school English and had no idea who the Thornfield family was, living a life my father would be proud of, a life I was proud of. I took out my phone and pulled up a photo I kept in a protected folder. My father and me when I was 10, standing in front of one of his buildings, both of us wearing hard hats and grinning. "I made it, Daddy," I whispered to the photo. I really made it. The sun broke through the clouds, warm on my face. A new beginning, a real one. And this time, no one could take it away from me.